Under the pale light of the twin moons, snowflakes drifted down in lazy spirals, settling on the shoulders of the human soldier who stood at the edge of the alien village. His name was Daniel, and the night air bit at his skin, but his attention was fixed on a small figure darting between tents. She moved with surprising speed for someone so small, her pointed ears twitching at every sound, her long black hair flowing like ink in the wind. Every time he glanced her way, she would throw him a look, somewhere between a challenge and a dare. Before vanishing behind another snow-covered tent, the villagers had not been warm to him since his arrival. He was an outsider, a human on a planet where his kind were rarely welcome. Yet this girl, barely reaching his chest in height, seemed determined to make her presence known. All day she had followed him at a distance, throwing small snowballs. When she thought he was not looking, laughing softly when he turned to catch her. It was not malice in her eyes, but something more playful, almost testing, as if she wanted to see how far she could push before he reacted. By midday, the teasing had become a game he could not ignore. She would appear near the well as he filled buckets, flicking drops of freezing water onto his hands. When he walked to the supply tent, she would leap from behind a barrel, tapping his arm and darting away before he could speak. Daniel's fellow soldiers shook their heads, telling him to ignore her. But there was something in her gaze, quick, bright, and unafraid, that kept him from doing so. It was rare for him to feel curious about anyone these days, but she was different. He learned her name when an older villager shouted it across the snow. Liara. The sound of it seemed to fit her perfectly, light and sharp all at once. When she heard it called, she would pause for just a heartbeat before returning to her mischievous antics. The other villagers seemed used to her restless energy, but Daniel noticed the way she often glanced toward the mountains beyond the village, as if listening for something only she could hear. There was a story behind her eyes, but she wasn't ready to tell it. By late afternoon, the snow had grown heavier, and the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke. Daniel had worked to finish repairs on one of the village's defense turrets, but Liara didn't stop her games. She perched on a snowbank, swinging her small legs, watching him with an expression that made him feel as if he were the one being tested. When he finally met her gaze for longer than a moment, she looked away quickly, her ears flattening for just a second before she hopped down and disappeared into the crowd. Night came early here, the sky darkening to deep blue as the temperature dropped. The soldiers retreated to their tents, and the villagers drew close to their fires. Daniel found himself outside longer than he needed to be, scanning the edge of the camp. He didn't see her until he heard the soft crunch of snow behind him. Liara stood there, no teasing smile on her face now, only a quiet stillness. The cold wind made her eyes shine, and she seemed smaller in the shadows. Without a word, she stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly. Something in the shift of her expression told him the games were over for the night. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but it carried enough weight to silence the noise of the camp around them. She spoke of a sound she had heard in the mountains, a warning her people ignored, and how the thought of being alone in the dark made her chest ache. The girl who had spent the day testing his patience now stood in front of him, her defiance gone, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. Without thinking, Daniel knelt in the snow, so they were eye level. She hesitated only a second before stepping forward and pressing her forehead lightly to his chest. The sound of her breathing was uneven, and her small frame trembled as he wrapped his arms around her. Snow fell in slow silence around them. And for the first time that day, she didn't try to run. In that moment, the teasing of the day faded into the background, replaced by something unspoken yet clear between them. The following morning, the village was quiet under a heavy blanket of snow. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the cold air carried the faint sound of distant voices. Daniel stepped out of his tent, scanning the area for any sign of Liara. After the way she had clung to him the previous night, he expected her to keep her distance, but a flash of movement near the well caught his eye. She was there, crouched low, shaping snow in her hands as if planning another ambush. She noticed him watching and froze for a heartbeat before rising to her feet. Her usual mischievous smirk was missing, replaced by something more cautious. Daniel crossed the snow between them, his boots crunching in the stillness. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked, his breath clouding in the frigid air. She tilted her head, her pointed ears switching, and gave a small nod. It was not convincing, but he decided not to press her yet. The rest of the day passed in small moments. Liara stayed close, but kept her teasing to a minimum, walking beside him as he checked the perimeter defenses. Once, she pointed out a section of the wall where the snow had built up, making it easier for something or someone to climb over. Her eyes flicked toward the mountains again, and Daniel recognized the same unease in her that he had seen before. She was young, but her instincts were sharp, and he was beginning to trust them. When they stopped at the supply tent, Liara hesitated at the entrance. Her gaze swept over the crates of rations and the neatly stacked fuel cells before she finally stepped inside. Daniel noticed her attention linger on the small heater in the corner, its warm glow a comfort in the bitter cold. She crouched near it for a moment, stretching her fingers toward the heat, and he saw how thin her gloves were. Without a word, he took off his own and handed them to her. She blinked up at him in surprise before accepting them with a quiet thank you. That evening, the soldiers gathered around the main fire to share news from the outer patrols. The talk was uneasy tracks had been found in the snow just beyond the ridge, too large to belong to any village animal. Liara sat beside Daniel, her small frame tucked into the folds of his coat for warmth. She listened without speaking, her eyes fixed on the flames. When one soldier suggested the tracks were nothing to worry about, she shifted closer to Daniel, her hand tightening around his sleeve. Later, when most had gone to their tents, Liara stayed by the fire. Daniel remained with her, watching the wave of light flickered across her features. She looked smaller in the glow, her earlier energy replaced by quiet thought. "They won't listen," she said at last, her voice barely carrying over the crackle of the wood. "But something is coming." Her words were simple, but the certainty in her tone made his stomach tighten. He asked her what she had heard, but she only shook her head, as if afraid to speak more. Snow began to fall again, thick and fast, settling on their shoulders. Daniel stood and offered her his hand, guiding her toward his tent. She hesitated at the entrance, glancing over her shoulder toward the dark outline of the mountains before stepping inside. The space was small, lit by the soft hum of a portable lamp. She settled onto the folded blanket he laid out for her, her hands still curled into fists inside his gloves. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the muffled wind outside the only sound. Before sleep claimed her, Liara shifted closer, her forehead resting lightly against his arm. "Stay," she whispered, so faintly he almost missed it. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak. He could feel the tension in her small frame slowly fade as her breathing evened out. Whatever threat lay beyond the mountains could wait for now. Tonight, in the quiet of the tent, she was safe, and he intended to keep it that way. At dawn, the cold air stung Daniel's face as he stepped outside. The snow had stopped, leaving the village wrapped in a pale, still quiet. He found Liara already awake, perched on a low wall near the edge of the camp. Her eyes were fixed on the distant ridge, her pointed ears angled toward the mountains, as if listening. She did not greet him with her usual spark, only gave a small nod when he approached. It was clear she had been awake for hours, her breath steady but her gaze unshaken. They walked the perimeter together, checking for fresh tracks in the snow. Daniel noticed how carefully she scanned every shadow, her small hands curling into fists inside his gloves. At one point, she crouched low, brushing her fingers against a faint indentation in the snow. "Not from the village," she murmured. The mark was shallow but stretched wide, like the step of something heavy. He wanted to tell her it might be nothing, but her expression stopped him. She knew this land better than any soldier could. When they returned to the main square, the soldiers were repairing one of the watchtowers. Liara kept her distance from the group, her eyes moving constantly. She seemed restless, her earlier teasing replaced by an alertness that reminded Daniel of a scout before a battle. "You should rest," he told her, but she shook her head without looking at him. There was no stubborn grin this time, only a quiet resolve that made her seem older than she was. Something in the air had shifted, and they both felt it. By midday, the sun broke through the clouds, throwing long shadows over the snow. Daniel and Liara worked side by side to clear a path between the tents, their breath rising in soft clouds. Occasionally she would pause, her head turning sharply toward the mountains, but each time she found nothing. When he asked what she expected to see, she only answered, "You'll know when it comes." Her words carried a weight he could not ignore, even as the day seemed deceptively calm. In the afternoon, a call came from the northern gate. A patrol had returned with more tracks, deeper this time, circling near the outer supply cache. The guards argued about whether it was an animal or something worse, but Daniel saw the way Lyra's ears tilted back and her jaw tightened. She stepped closer to him, her voice low. "It's testing the edges," she said. He didn't ask how she knew. She had been right before, and he would trust her now. As night approached, the temperature dropped sharply, and the sky turned a bruised shade of purple. The villagers moved inside, and the fires burned higher. Liara stayed near Daniel, her steps quick as they made one last round of the perimeter. At the far end, she stopped suddenly, her eyes narrowing. In the distance, half hidden by the snow, something moved. It was too far to see clearly, but the shape was wrong for any wild animal. Daniel's hand went to his weapon, but when he looked down, Liara shook her head. "Not yet," she whispered. They returned to the fire in silence. The crackle of burning wood and the low murmur of voices filled the air, but Daniel's thoughts stayed on the shadow in the snow. Liara sat close to him, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "it will come closer." He wanted to tell her not to worry, but the way she spoke left no room for comfort. She was not guessing, she was certain. That certainty seeped into him, settling like the weight of the snow on the tents. When the fire burned low, Daniel walked her back to the tent. The village was still, the snow crunching softly beneath their boots. Inside, the lamp cast a faint golden glow. Liara sat on her blanket, pulling the gloves tighter around her hands. She glanced at him once before lowering her eyes. "Stay close tomorrow," she said, her voice almost a command. Daniel nodded, the promise unspoken but understood. Whatever was out there, they would face it together. The wind howled through the village before dawn, rattling the tent flaps and carrying with it a sharp scent of frost. Daniel rose quickly, his instincts already on edge. Liara was awake too, standing near the entrance, her small form wrapped in his coat. She didn't look at him when she spoke, only said, "It's closer now." There was no hesitation in her voice, and he knew she had been listening to the sounds outside long before he opened his eyes. They stepped out into the snow, the sky still heavy with the darkness before sunrise. The guard at the northern gate waved them over, pointing toward the ridge. Faint shapes moved against the white expanse, their outlines blurred by drifting snow. Daniel counted at least 3, maybe more, but they were too far to make out clearly. Lyra's ears twitched as she tracked their movements, her eyes narrowing. "They're circling," she murmured. The way she said it made him feel as if she knew exactly what they were. The rest of the soldiers were slow to believe her. Some insisted the shapes were just wild animals looking for food, nothing to worry about. But Daniel had learned not to dismiss her warnings. He checked his weapon, the cold metal biting against his gloves, and began preparations for a possible defense. Liara stayed close, offering short, precise advice about which paths through the snow were most likely to be used for an approach. Her tone was steady, but he caught the faint tremor in her hands. By midday, the shapes had disappeared from sight, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The village went about its routines, though everyone moved a little faster, their eyes darting toward the gates. Daniel and Liara walked the outer walls, scanning for fresh tracks. They found them near the southern side, deep impressions in the snow that led nowhere. The trail ended abruptly, as if whatever made it had vanished into the air. Liara stared at the marks for a long moment, before turning away without a word. When the sun began to sink, the patrols reported no new sightings. That should have been good news, but the tension in the air only grew thicker. Daniel found Liara near the central fire, her knees drawn up, eyes distant. She didn't speak when he sat beside her, only leaned slightly against him. The warmth of the flames did little to ease the chill between them. Something was coming, and she knew it. He could feel her thoughts turning over in silence, too heavy to share just yet. Later, as the village prepared to sleep, a sound rose from the darkness beyond the gates, a low, drawn-out cry that seemed to scrape across the night air. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to stop every conversation and send a shiver through the crowd. Daniel felt Lyra's hand grip his sleeve tightly. "That's not an animal," she said, her voice almost lost in the wind. The soldiers moved toward the gates, their weapons ready, but no one could see where the sound had come from. Daniel made the decision to stay near Lyra's tent for the night. She didn't argue, though she watched the entrance as if expecting it to move. The hours stretched on in silence, broken only by the groan of the wind. At one point, she whispered something in her own language, the words soft and rhythmic. He didn't understand them, but the tone carried a quiet determination. Whatever she feared, she was ready to face it. That resolve settled deep in him, steadying his own nerves. Just before dawn, he noticed her sitting upright, her ears alert. "It's here," she said simply. There was no trace of fear in her voice now, only certainty. Daniel rose, weapon in hand, and moved toward the entrance with her close behind. Outside, the snow was falling again, and the world was hushed. But beyond the veil of white, a darker shape moved, gliding closer to the village walls. The moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. The first light of morning revealed the snow piled high against the village walls. The darker shape they had seen the night before was gone, leaving only a scattering of fresh tracks. Daniel crouched near them, brushing away a thin layer of frost. The prints were deep, larger than a human's, and spread far apart as if whatever made them moved with great speed. Liara stood beside him, silent but watchful. Her breath was slow, and her gaze followed the trail as it curved toward the northern ridge. The soldiers argued again about whether to pursue or reinforce the gates. Some wanted to chase the intruder before it could return, but Daniel noticed Lyra's ears tilt sharply at their words. "If you follow it now, you won't come back," she said flatly. The tone left no room for debate. Her eyes did not leave the snow, and Daniel could tell she was weighing more than she was saying. Whatever this was, it was not just a wandering creature, it was deliberate. By midday, the village was on edge. Patrols moved in pairs, and the fires at the gates burned brighter. Daniel worked with two others to strengthen the southern wall, but his attention kept drifting to where Liara stood near the watchtower. She had her arms folded, her gaze scanning the horizon. At one point, she climbed halfway up the tower and stayed there, unmoving, for several minutes. When she came down, she walked directly to him and said, "It's testing us." Her certainty cut through the cold air like a blade. The afternoon passed in tense quiet. Snow fell in soft waves, blurring the outlines of the mountains. Liara stayed close to Daniel, her small steps leaving light prints beside his. She spoke little, but when she did, it was to point out small details others missed. A faint shift in the snow, a shadow moving against the wind. Daniel realized that her teasing from earlier days had been more than just play. She had been watching him, learning how he reacted, testing whether he would listen when it mattered. As night approached, the village gathered near the main fire again. Stories of old hunts and battles were told to mask the fear creeping in. The edges of their voices. Liara sat beside Daniel, her knees drawn to her chest. The flicker of the flames lit her face in shades of gold and shadow. When a soldier boasted that no outsider could defend the village better than they could, she glanced at Daniel with a look that said she knew the truth was more complicated. He met her gaze without speaking, the message clear between them, hours. Later, a sound unlike the one before rippled through the night. It was sharper, closer, almost a breath against the ear. Daniel was on his feet instantly, his weapon ready. Liara was already moving toward the northern wall, her speed startling for someone so small. He followed, the snow crunching hard beneath his boots. At the top of the wall, she pointed into the swirling white. A shadow shifted there, slow but deliberate, as if it knew they were watching. Then it vanished again, leaving the wind to fill the silence. The guards doubled their watch, and Daniel stayed on the wall until his limbs ached from the cold. Liara refused to go inside, her attention locked on the darkness beyond the torches. She didn't fidget or speak, she simply waited, as if she understood the patience of whatever was out there. When at last she allowed herself to be led back to the tent, she moved with the same quiet purpose, her mind clearly still on the ridge. Daniel could feel the weight of the night pressing in around them. Before sleeping, Liara turned to him and said, "Tomorrow, it will try to come inside." The words were steady, not fearful. Daniel nodded once, his hand tightening on the weapon beside him. He understood now that her warnings were not guesses. She had been right every time. Whatever came next, they would be ready for it, and he would not let her face it alone. The morning came heavy with silence, the kind that made even the crackle of the fires seem too loud. Daniel stepped outside to find the villagers moving quickly, securing shutters and adding more wood to the flames. Liara was already at the northern wall, her hair whipping in the wind, eyes fixed on the snow beyond. She did not turn when he approached, only said, "It will come today." Her voice carried a finality that left no room for doubt. The guards kept their weapons close, scanning every drift and shadow. Daniel took a place beside Liara, the cold biting through his coat. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching with the tension that gripped the air. Then a movement broke the stillness. Dark forms, low to the ground, moving with unnatural grace across the snow. They stopped just beyond bow range, their shapes almost blending into the white. Liara's ears tilted forward as she whispered, "It's watching us." The words were almost lost in the wind when one of the guards raised his weapon. Daniel shook his head. "Not yet," he said firmly. He could feel Liara's gaze on him, as if measuring whether he truly understood. The creature stayed there for what felt like an eternity before shifting back into the blizzard. No attack came, but Daniel knew this was only the first step. The way they moved, the way they vanished, it was deliberate, testing the defenses. Exactly as she had predicted, the rest of the day passed under a heavy watch. Liara walked the perimeter with Daniel, pointing out weaknesses others overlooked. A pile of snow too close to the wall, a section of gate hinge that groaned in the wind. Every detail mattered to her, and Daniel found himself adjusting patrol routes based on her observations. The soldiers began to listen as well, their earlier doubts replaced by quiet respect. She had earned her place among them without ever lifting a weapon. By late afternoon, the snowfall had slowed and the light turned dim and blue. Daniel was at the southern wall when he heard the first scream. He ran toward the sound, Liara already ahead of him. Near the main gate, one of the guards was down, his leg pulled sharply to one side, as if something had struck from below. The snow around him was churned up, fresh tracks leading into the darkness beyond. Liara crouched beside the trail, her eyes sharp. "It's here," she said, and this time there was no mistaking the urgency. The alarm was raised, and the village moved with controlled panic. Fires were stoked higher, archers took position, and the gates were reinforced. Daniel stayed close to Liara, the two of them moving together as if they had done so for years. In the distance, a low growl echoed through the snow, closer than before. The sound set his teeth on edge, and he saw Lyra's shoulders tense. Whatever was out there was not simply hunting, it was choosing its moment. The wind carried another sound then, softer but more chilling, a faint scraping, like claws on ice. Daniel's grip on his weapon tightened. He scanned the snow ahead but saw only the swirling white. Liara stepped forward slightly, her posture low and ready. In that moment, he realized she had been preparing for this since the first day she started teasing him. Every glance toward the mountains, every careful observation, had been leading to this night. When darkness settled fully, the first shadow moved into the torchlight. It was tall, its limbs too long, its movements too smooth. More followed, their eyes catching the light with an unnatural gleam. Daniel shifted his stance, ready for the fight that could decide the fate of the village. Liara stood beside him, small but unshaken. For the first time since he had met her, there was no teasing in her expression, only the steady courage of someone who would not run, no matter what came. The creatures advanced slowly, their movements careful, as if measuring the reach of the defenders' weapons. Daniel kept his stance firm, eyes locked on the one that seemed to lead the rest. It was taller than the others, its frame bent in a way that suggested both speed and strength. Lyra's breath was steady beside him, her gaze unblinking. "It will test the gate first," she murmured, and within moments, the leader shifted toward the main entrance, its steps deliberate. Arrows flew, striking the snow at the creature's feet, but it only paused before stepping back into the blizzard. The others scattered into the darkness, their outlines dissolving in the wind. The silence that followed was heavier than the sounds of their approach. Daniel knew they had not been driven away, only forced to wait for a better opening. Lyra's hand brushed his sleeve briefly, not as comfort but as confirmation that his thoughts matched hers. The next hour was a tense rhythm of stillness and sudden flashes of movement. Shadows darted in and out of the torchlight, never long enough to target. Daniel moved along the wall with Liara close behind, their eyes sweeping the snow for signs of the next approach. Twice, they caught glimpses of claws dragging across the frozen ground, leaving deep grooves that disappeared under fresh snowfall. The sight only deepened the weight in his chest. When the attack finally came, it was fast and coordinated. 2 creatures lunged at the southern wall while a third struck at the gate. The clash of weapons and the roar of the beasts shattered the night's quiet. Daniel's blade met the nearest attacker, the force of the blow rattling up his arm. Liara moved with surprising precision, darting forward to strike at the creature's leg with a sharpened spear tip. It howled, twisting away, but not before leaving a deep gash in the wooden barricade. The defenders fought hard, forcing the creatures back step by step. Snow churned underfoot, and the cold air was thick with the sound of steel and snarls. Liara stayed within arm's reach of Daniel, striking only when she saw an opening. Her small size made her harder to target, but it also meant he had to watch her constantly. When the leader finally retreated into the storm, the others followed, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. The sudden quiet felt unreal after the chaos. Breathing hard, Daniel scanned the wall for damage. The gate held, though the wood was splintered and weakened. The guards moved to reinforce it while others tended to the wounded. Liara stood still for a long moment, her eyes on the direction the creatures had fled. "They will come again," she said quietly, her tone as certain as ever. Daniel didn't question it. He only nodded, already thinking of what would need to be done before the next assault. Later, in the shelter of the tent, Liara sat cross-legged on the blanket, her hands still wrapped in his gloves. She was quieter than usual, her energy burned away by the fight. Daniel lowered himself beside her, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones. She looked at him once, as if about to speak, then instead leaned against his shoulder. It was not fear that held her there now, but trust. In the flicker of the lamp's light, that trust felt heavier than any weapon he carried. Before sleep took them, she finally whispered, "We will be ready next time." The words were simple, but they carried a promise that reached beyond the night's survival. Daniel didn't answer, only rested his hand lightly on her arm. The storm outside still raged, but in that small space, the air was steady. Whatever came with the dawn, they would face it together, as they had tonight. The storm had eased by morning, but the air carried a sharp clarity that made every sound seem louder. Daniel walked the perimeter with Liara at his side, the snow crunching under their boots. The tracks left by the creatures were partially covered now, but still visible enough to follow. They led away from the village, weaving toward the mountains where the blizzard clouds still gathered. Liara paused. At the edge of the trail, her eyes narrowed. "They will wait until we grow careless," she said with quiet certainty. The day was spent reinforcing the walls and repairing the gate. The villagers moved with more focus than before, their earlier doubts replaced by the memory of the night's attack. Daniel oversaw the work, directing soldiers and civilians alike, but his attention often drifted to where Liara was helping carry supplies. She worked with a determination that seemed too strong for her small frame, her breath visible in the cold as she lifted bundles almost half her size. When she noticed him watching, she only raised an eyebrow and kept working. By midday, a faint sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow. The brief light brought a moment of warmth, but it also revealed more tracks fresher, ones leading toward the eastern slope. Daniel and Liara followed them until the trees grew dense and the snow deeper. There, they found signs of a temporary camp, flattened snow, scattered bits of frozen debris, and claw marks on tree bark. Liara crouched beside the marks, tracing them with her fingers. "They are stronger than they looked," she murmured. They returned to the village before sunset, carrying the weight of what they had seen. The council of elders met in the central hall, their faces lined with worry. Daniel explained the threat in simple, direct terms, but it was Lyra's voice that carried the most conviction. She spoke of the patterns she had seen, the patience of the creatures, and how they would not stop until the village was theirs. Her words silenced the room, and for the first time, no one dismissed her warnings. As night fell, torches were lit along the walls, their flames swaying in the wind. Daniel stood beside Liara at the northern gate, both of them wrapped in heavy cloaks. The cold bit at his skin, but his focus stayed on the horizon. "You should rest," he told her, but she shook her head without looking away. "Not tonight," she replied, her voice firm. He understood. This was no longer about caution, it was about readiness, about making sure no opening was left for the enemy. The hours passed with only the sound of the wind and the occasional creak of the wooden walls. Then, in the deep quiet before dawn, a shape appeared in the distance. It was the leader, standing alone against the snow, its gaze fixed on the gate. It did not move closer, did not retreat. It simply stood there, as if making its presence known. Lyra's breath hitched, but she did not step back. Instead, she lifted her chin and met its stare. After a long moment, the creature turned and vanished into the white. When the sun finally rose, the village was still intact. No attack had come, but Daniel knew the absence of violence was not safety, it was strategy. He turned to Liara, finding her watching the horizon with the same sharp focus as always. "It's not finished," she said softly. He nodded, the truth of her words settling heavy in his chest. But there was something else in her eyes now, a spark that had nothing to do with fear. It was resolve, unshakable and shared, that evening. As the fires burned high and the wall stood strong, Daniel and Liara sat together in the quiet of his tent. She leaned against him, her small frame warm against his side. "We held them once," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "and we will again." Daniel rested a hand lightly over hers, the unspoken promise binding them more strongly than any wall could. Outside, the snow fell softly, but inside, they were steady, ready, and no longer alone.